Jake Turner, a battle-hardened veteran and long-haul trucker, thought it was just another lonely drive across the scorching desert. Then, out of nowhere, a blockade appeared. 5 masked gunmen, weapons aimed directly at him. They wanted his cargo. What they didn't know was that they had just made a fatal mistake. If you love gripping stories of tough truckers, real justice, and bad guys getting what they deserve, hit subscribe now. Don't miss the next unbelievable tale. Trust me, you won't regret it. The sun hung low over the vast desert highway, casting long golden shadows across the endless stretch of asphalt. Dust swirled in the dry wind, curling like restless spirits around the jagged rocks and brittle shrubs that lined the desolate road. The air was thick with heat, pressing down like an invisible hand, and the distant hum of a semi-truck's diesel engine broke the eerie silence. Jake Holloway, a veteran trucker with over 3 decades of hard miles behind him, adjusted his grip on the wheel of his old but reliable rig, the Iron Phantom. The name wasn't just for show. It had been through wars of the road, dodging reckless drivers, evading bandits in the borderlands, and cutting through the heart of storms that swallowed lesser rigs whole. To Jake, this truck was more than metal and rubber. It was his fortress, his livelihood, and his weapon when needed. He rolled down the window, letting the warm desert wind whip through the cab, rattling the small American flag pinned to his sun visor. The highway stretched ahead, an unbroken ribbon of faded asphalt leading straight into the heart of nowhere. It was supposed to be a quiet haul, just another long, lonely drive carrying high-value cargo for a private contractor. Then, he saw them. In his side mirror, a convoy of blacked-out SUVs roared down the road behind him, their dark silhouettes stark against the shimmering heat waves. Jake's stomach tightened. He'd been on enough of these routes to know when something didn't feel right. There were no towns for miles, no rest stops, no reason for a pack of SUVs to be out here unless they were hunting something or someone. His hands flexed on the wheel. The SUVs spread out behind him, their formation tightening like wolves circling prey. Then, without warning, they surged forward, pulling alongside his 18-wheeler. Jake flicked his eyes to the dashboard camera. The lead SUV veered in front of him, hitting the brakes hard. He had seconds to react. Gripping the wheel tight, he stomped on the brakes, his truck hissing as air brakes locked up. The Iron Phantom groaned, tires screeching as it kicked up a storm of dust and gravel. Men in tactical gear jumped out, their faces obscured by black masks. They moved fast, weapons drawn, military-style precision. Jake didn't panic. Instead, he exhaled slowly, reaching for the hidden compartment below his seat. The cold steel of his old friend, a well-worn Colt .45, pressed against his palm. They thought they had stopped a helpless trucker. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Jake Holloway watched in the side mirror as the masked gunmen fanned out, positioning themselves around his rig. The lead SUV had slammed to a stop in front of him, forcing the Iron Phantom to a grinding halt. Dust and heat waves distorted the figures as they moved swiftly, trained, disciplined. This wasn't some ragtag group of amateurs. These men knew what they were doing. The closest one, a broad-shouldered thug gripping an M4, pounded on the truck's door. "Out of the truck! Now!" His voice was muffled behind a balaclava, but the threat was clear. Jake didn't move. The others took position, 2 at the rear, 2 flanking his doors, and another crouching near the front tire, his pistol aimed high. The leader stepped forward, tapping the barrel of his rifle against the door. "You're carrying something valuable," the man said. "We're taking it. Cooperate, and you won't get hurt." Jake sighed, running a hand over his beard. He had been through enough in his lifetime to recognize the type. These weren't just desert scavengers. This was a coordinated hijacking, mercenaries or cartel muscle looking to score big. The problem was, they had picked the wrong damn trucker. Still, He played along. All right, Jake grumbled, raising his hands as he unlocked the door and swung it open. He stepped down slowly, his boots kicking up a small cloud of dust. The heat was suffocating, but the tension in the air was thicker. The moment his feet touched the ground, two men grabbed him, forcing him onto his knees. The leader leaned in, pressing the muzzle of his rifle against Jake's forehead. "What's in the truck?" the man demanded. Jake squinted up at him, unfazed. "You boys have no idea what you're getting into." The leader scoffed. "We know exactly what we're doing, old man. That truck's carrying high-value cargo, and you're just the unlucky son of a bitch driving it." Behind them, one of the masked men was already climbing into the cab, rummaging through Jake's things. Another was working on the trailer lock, attempting to pry it open. Big mistake. Jake felt the grip on his arms loosen just slightly as his captors assumed he was no threat. That was all he needed. In one explosive motion, he drove his elbow backward into the gut of the man holding him, knocking the wind out of him. With a pivot, he reached for the pistol holstered at the man's side, yanking it free before spinning on his knee and firing twice. The first shot sent one of the rear guards staggering. The second hit the man at the trailer, forcing him to drop his crowbar. Shouts erupted as the hijackers scrambled for cover. Jake dove behind his truck's massive front tire, using the Iron Phantom as a shield. Bullets ricocheted off the metal frame as the gang opened fire. They thought they had an easy target. They had no idea they'd just started a war. The gunfire rang out across the empty desert highway, each shot kicking up dirt and sparks as bullets clanged against the Iron Phantom's steel frame. Jake Holloway crouched low, reloading the pistol he had stolen from one of the hijackers. His pulse was steady, his mind razor-sharp. He had been in worse situations before. The mercenary leader, still crouched near the front of the truck, barked out orders. "Flank him! Pin him down! We end this now!" But Jake had no intention of being pinned down. He reached into the Iron Phantom's side compartment and yanked out a road flare. In one smooth motion, he struck it against the rough metal, igniting the bright red flame. With his other hand, he unhooked a canister of diesel fuel he kept for emergencies. "Cover fire! Move in!" one of the thugs shouted as they advanced. Jake smirked. They had made their first fatal mistake. They assumed he was cornered. With a grunt, he rolled the fuel canister toward them. The metal clunked against the dirt, bouncing once before landing right in the middle of their formation. The moment their eyes followed it, Jake hurled the burning flare. "Move! Move!" someone screamed. Too late. The flare struck the canister, and in an instant, a fireball erupted between them. The shockwave sent two of the gunmen flying, while the others scrambled away from the raging flames. The intense heat forced them to retreat, coughing and shielding their faces from the blast. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. He bolted toward the leader, who was momentarily stunned by the explosion. In one fluid motion, Jake slammed into him, knocking the rifle from his hands. The younger man fought back, landing a blow against Jake's ribs, but he had underestimated the strength behind a veteran trucker's fists. Jake caught him by the collar, twisted, and threw him face first into the side of the truck. The man collapsed, groaning. The remaining hijackers hesitated, their confidence shattered. One by one, they scrambled for their vehicles, abandoning their fallen leader. Tires screeched as their SUVs tore away into the desert, kicking up dust as they retreated. Jake exhaled, wiping a line of sweat from his brow. He turned to the mercenary leader, who was still groaning on the ground. "Guess that didn't go the way you planned, huh?" Jake muttered. The man coughed, looking up at him with dazed, terrified eyes. And just like that, the tables had turned. Jake Holloway stood over the battered mercenary leader, dust swirling around him in the wake of the gang's frantic retreat. His knuckles were bruised, his shirt singed from the explosion, but his heartbeat was steady, just like it had been in every fight he'd ever faced. The leader groaned, spitting blood into the sand. You don't know who you're messing with." Jake chuckled dryly, crouching beside him. "Oh, I think I do. He grabbed the man by the collar and yanked him upright, forcing him to look into his cold, steel-gray eyes. You're a hired gun. You don't know what you're fighting for, just who's paying you. The mercenary's lips curled into a weak smirk. And you're just a trucker. Jake sighed, shaking his head. That's where you're wrong. With one swift motion, he reached into the mercenary's tactical vest and yanked out a small radio, still crackling with static. He clicked the side button. We lost him, boss, a panicked voice came through. He took out Davis and Miller. We can't get close. There was a long silence. Then a new voice, a deeper, more calculated tone. Pull back. Let him go. We'll find another way. Jake narrowed his eyes. He recognized that voice. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered under his breath. The mercenary leader grinned, despite the pain. Now you get it. Jake tossed the radio to the ground and stomped on it, silencing the voice. He grabbed the leader by the back of the vest and dragged him toward the Iron Phantom, slamming him against the rust-covered grill. Who sent you? Jake growled. The mercenary coughed but said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Jake clenched his jaw. He had spent years running from his past, trying to leave behind the things he'd done, the people he had crossed. But it seemed like the past wasn't done with him. The voice on the radio, he knew exactly who it belonged to. Ethan Grayson. Once, they had been on the same side. Grayson had been his commanding officer in a unit that didn't officially exist, the kind of team sent in to do the jobs no one else could stomach. But when Jake had finally left that life behind, Grayson had stayed, building something darker, something more dangerous. And now, he had sent men to take Jake down. The realization sent a slow, icy wave through Jake's chest. This wasn't some random hijacking. They hadn't been after his cargo. They had been after him. Jake exhaled sharply, pushing back the anger rising in his gut. He had spent years avoiding this fight, pretending it would never come. But it was here now. He looked down at the mercenary leader, who was still catching his breath. Tell your boss something for me, Jake said, his voice deadly calm. Tell him I'm not running anymore. The mercenary's smirk faltered, fear flickering in his eyes. Jake stepped back, letting go of the man's vest. Go, he ordered. The leader didn't hesitate. He staggered backward, then turned and ran, disappearing into the desert haze. Jake watched him go, his fists tightening at his sides. This was just the beginning. Jake Holloway stood beside his truck, watching the sun dip below the desert horizon, casting an orange glow over the wreckage left behind. Smoke curled from a few burning vehicles. Bullet casings littered the sand, and the mercenaries who had survived were long gone, vanishing into the wasteland. The desert had swallowed them whole, just like it had swallowed so many others before them. But Jake was still standing. His knuckles were raw, his ribs ached, and his shirt was stained with dust, sweat, and the remnants of a fight that had never been about his cargo. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his graying hair. This wasn't just another attack. This wasn't some random gang looking for a payday. This was personal. The voice on that radio still echoed in his mind. Ethan Grayson. For years, Jake had done everything in his power to outrun his past. He had left that world behind. The world of black ops, of kill missions, of being a ghost in the night. When he traded in his rifle for a set of truck keys, he had convinced himself that the war was over, that he could just be another man on the road, a nameless driver hauling freight across the country. But the past had finally caught up to him. Grayson wasn't the kind of man to let things go. If he had sent a team after Jake, it meant only one thing. He wasn't going to stop. Jake had to assume this was just a test, a warning shot, a way for Grayson to gauge whether Jake was still as sharp, still as dangerous, as he had been in the old days. The answer had been loud and clear. Jake stepped onto the truck's running board and pulled himself into the cab, wincing as his sore muscles protested. He reached for the glove box, the same place where he had kept his sidearm all these years. He pulled it out, checking the magazine. Fully loaded. He hadn't needed to fire a single shot today. His fists and his instincts had been enough. But next time, he might not be so lucky. He leaned back in his seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly, staring down the long, open highway ahead. The road stretched on forever, just like it always had. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a battlefield. Jake had a choice. He could keep running, keep hoping that Grayson would get tired of the chase. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't going to end until one of them was dead. And Jake wasn't ready to die. A slow smirk crossed his lips as he put the truck into gear, the engine rumbling beneath him. If Grayson wanted a war, he had just picked the wrong damn trucker. Jake's foot pressed down on the accelerator, kicking up dust as the rig roared back onto the road. This wasn't over, not by a long shot.